Also I heard the voice of the Lord saying,
Whom shall I send? And who will go for us?
Then said I, Here am I, send me. And he said,
Go! And you tell this people, hear ye indeed,
but understand not, and see ye indeed, but perceive not. Make the heart. Hello, good morning. Welcome to Line by Line Bible Studies. And we will continue today in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 10. We talked about, I feel like my monitor doesn't seem to, oh wait, I played with this. Yeah, look at that. Oh, we talked about, Paul gives his, endorsement of marriage, kind of tepid. I mean, absolute, but also, he mentions that he preferred if people weren't married, but he wanted to absolutely confirm that it was perfectly acceptable within righteousness. And we discussed how, one might consider that, even having anything to do with another person in some regards, defiles you as far as when you look at the law and stuff, and the idea of that it is a bodily function, and therefore it is a sort of profane thing. It's not something that's done in the temple, So it's an odd, the sacraments generally are performed, like in the Catholic Church, are performed in the church, like baptism, communion, and they marry you in the church, but you really don't get married till you get home, until you get in bed together. That's marriage. And so that aspect, and because that's when he talks about defrauding not one another, he's not talking about, I covered up that hole and I left one little sliver, and the light is just right in my eye. Anyways, I'll get that tomorrow. Okay, so now we're going to talk about divorce. Verse 10. And unto the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord, let not the wife depart from her husband. But, and if she depart, let her remain unmarried, or be reconciled to her husband. And let not the husband put away his wife. That's the way it's described in the Bible. The divorce was given to men lawfully, like they had the legal right to divorce. Women just could leave. I don't think they had to formally do anything except go away. And that was easier for them in a sense, because there was no legal trapping around it. And okay, so in Christianity, there's no, though, like he says, he commands let not the husband depart from the wife, and the wife from her husband. Let not the wife depart, let not the husband put her away. Well, then he immediately acknowledges, okay, if you do it, if you absolutely must, and I can think of a lot of reasons why you could leave your husband, like if you fear for your physical safety. I could see a reason why a woman might physically leave the home that she's living in, but the Christian thing to do is to not immediately marry somebody else or live with somebody else. Go home to mom or something, or some other safe place, but not immediately into another man's bed, because you should seek to be reconciled. Or it says remain unmarried. And I've, and some people, that's I mean, can you get remarried? That's adultery. I mean, then you're committing adultery. Uh, and that's the way the Lord teaches it. That's the way the apostles teach it. And if you don't like it, you can do that, and that's adultery. But remember, that's what it is. It's like people always want to oh no, you've got the divorce, and that makes it all right. It doesn't. It doesn't. When you get divorced, the next person you go to be with, you're committing adultery. And very often fornication anyways, which is a sin. Very few people get divorced and then run off and remarry right away. Usually they feel the sting of it and they say, well, I'm not going to do that so carelessly again. Sometimes it spooks them off of it for good. After a divorce or four, people get the sense of maybe I shouldn't marry. But instead of saying celibate, they decide to just become serial fornicators, which often is the way they began their life anyway, so they're just going back to the start. The same goes for the man. He's not, if a man, Jesus put it in context of the man. He says, whoever puts away his wife causes her to commit adultery, and he that marries her that is put away commits adultery. Jesus, right? That's what Jesus had to say about it. And, you think about it, that was something that Jesus, he said that. And it's an obvious Christian teaching that is in opposition to Judaism. Or let's say it's to the abuses of Judaism at the time. Because at the time, certainly, they had abused the right they had to divorce to the point where they believed they could divorce a woman for any cause. Like, if he found another woman more attractive, if he just liked another woman better, he could divorce his wife and marry her. And you understand the context of Judaism, he was a righteous man. He'd followed the law. And Jesus was simply saying, that's not righteous. It's not righteous to just divorce your wife. There are causes for divorce, but they're significant. You can't just be well, she's prettier, or she's sweeter, or I'm sick of this one. That there was no. That's the kind of. They said well, we could give Moses commanded to give a writing of divorcement, so it's practically a commandment. So when you divorce, you're doing something virtuous. It's just you just give him a slip of paper or say it to him. Oh, we're divorced now. If you say it 3 times or something, I remember hearing that from someone. I don't know if that's actually accurate. If you say it 3 times to her in a row, you basically are divorced. In some cultures or whatever, I divorce you. Whatever. I don't know how accurate that actually is. Now, that was to the married, and he's saying to those of you who are married and believe. If you're married to a believer, no matter what the cause you're feeling that you have to leave them for, there's always reason to hope, if you're married to a believer, that you can be reconciled. The only reason people don't get reconciled is because they don't want to. Because they themselves are hard and embittered. And yes, you've sinned now, and you're leaving your husband and not seeking to be reconciled. I don't want to be reconciled to him, because the truth is, what's underlying the surface is I'm sick of him. I don't want to give him a chance to be reconciled, because I'm afraid he'll do it. I'm afraid he'll reform his behavior, and I'll have to accept him. And I'm just sick. I can't stand looking at him. And they become so embittered. And there's a lot of reasons people become bitter: jealousy, envy, just no end. And it's all, they poison their relationship with wicked thoughts. And it's something that happens over time. It's not something that happens overnight. Over time, you should cherish your relationship and build it up with good thoughts about your spouse. And as a spouse, you should endeavor to build up goodwill and good feelings, right? And both through intimate contact and just through good relations. Not being, if you're, not picking on everything they do, whether you're male or female. Not being like super critical all the time, or being passive aggressive or brooding. And there's all kinds of ways in which we can drive wedges between each other. But the thing to do is to be engaged, and if there are problems, you don't want to just brush them off. You got to work through them to some degree. Some things can be brushed off. It depends on personalities also. Marriage is a complicated thing. It's not something that you easily navigate without a slip up here and there. But the point is, for Christians, for believers, there's no cause for which to divorce another believer that you can't be reconciled over. I do understand, like Jesus said, there were certain exceptions for divorce. He said fornication and adultery. And adultery, you can be reconciled over adultery, and a lot of Christians do seek to be so. But in my opinion, this is my opinion, you are not obligated to. And I mean will they actually go and have an affair? That could be, well, certainly here's the thing. If they have if they're having an affair and they don't want to be reconciled, obviously you can get divorced. They may divorce you. You can always let the other person divorce you. That happens. What you're not allowed to do is to foster that situation and to help that grow by being a bad spouse and sort of subtly encouraging a divorce through neglect and not being a good spouse. That you can actually bring about divorce, and if you're attentive to things, you can not make sure maybe, but certainly give as few reasons as possible for the other partner to commit some great sin that would lead to a divorce. Now, if someone makes a mistake, like let's say someone is tempted and they commit adultery and they are contrite and repentant and stuff like, as two Christians, on some level, it's like we might be obligated to forgive them, but that could be a very difficult relationship from that point in. So by all means, avoid adultery, because even if you are reconciled, it may not be possible to have a good relationship going forward. It's something to be avoided at all costs. So, and then now it speaks to people married to unbelievers, okay? Because that's the situation. Sometimes you're a believer married to a believer, and that's good, and there's great hope for reconciliation in all kinds of causes. Certainly a lot of the stupid things like irreconcilable differences. If you're Christian, there should be no such thing as irreconcilable differences. If it's like, well, I want a bigger house. It's like, as a Christian, you're sort of or I want her to get I want her to get some sort of physical enhancement. Someone like that, wanting some ridiculous thing from their spouse. It's hard to. It's like it's not a you know what I mean, like a really that's there are a lot of bad reasons people come into conflict that I wouldn't consider really Christian reasons. Christians should be able to work things out, especially the longer you're walking with Christ and the longer you're married. It should become easier to work out. That's what I've found. Things can become easier to work out and less difficult. Just like your life in general, just the way you're walking Christ becomes, better and better and brighter unto the perfect day. So also your marriage has the potential to become better and better and brighter to the perfect marriage, or approaching close to perfect as one can get in the carnal world. And a lot of times you'll see really old couples who seem to have found great affection and peace between themselves. So, all right, now to the believers married to unbelievers, verse 12. But to the rest speak I, not the Lord. I mean, this is before he said, this is a commandment. Let not the wife depart. Let not the husband put her away. Except maybe there's a short period. If you do it, he's making a caveat. Okay, if you do it, then here's the second tier of rules I'd like you to think about. Stay unmarried or try to be reconciled. All right, that's between two Christians. And notice he just says that for the woman, when she leaves, she should stay unmarried or try to be reconciled. For the guy, he just shouldn't divorce her. Because guys don't get to run away. That's generally not what happens. Though I suppose they do these days, right? It just was, the roles were much more clearly defined. My throat is so dry. Okay, but to the rest speak I, not the Lord, no matter of his informed opinion. If any brother hath a wife that believeth not, and she be pleased to dwell with him, let him not put her away. If you're just married to an unbeliever, let's say you were two unbelievers, you become a Christian and they don't. Well, let's say early in your life, you're a believer and you marry. I don't know why a Christian would marry an unbeliever unless they were a nominal Christian. Like, you might be a nominal Christian and you marry a nominal Buddhist, right? Or a nominal Jew. And you're in your 20s and you think, my religion is not a big deal to me. And nor is theirs to theirs. But then you have a kid and all of a sudden maybe it starts becoming important to you. Or you just, maybe you have a brush with death and religion becomes important. Maybe for all kinds of reasons. Whatever reason, you become very serious about your faith. And now it's a problem for you that your wife is a non-believer and it eats you up, it bugs you. Maybe there is no kid, and maybe it's so annoying to you that you'd kind of like to leave. Maybe you're two nominal Christians married to each other, and then you become real serious and they don't. That can be frustrating, because being married to a nominal Christian is almost like, it feels like you're married to an unbeliever, because so little of their lives are ordered according to Christ, right? They're not listening. But you were that way too, you could argue. It's like, yeah, but I changed at this time. Everyone has their proper time. There's no exact knowledge of when your life is going to turn around, if at all. But he says, do not be, if they are pleased to dwell with you, let them not put them away. And the woman which hath an husband that believeth not, and if he be pleased to dwell with her, let her not leave him. Same for both sexes. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. Else were your children unclean, but now they are holy. So the marriage relationship is holy enough that it even sanctifies an unbeliever, at least in the sense that your children are not like going to, I guess maybe it's something that people were concerned about. Is it okay to have children with an unbeliever? Or what if I already have children with an unbeliever? And how does your faith sanctify? It doesn't mean save. You know what I mean? What it means is, like, it still is special. It still is, as they say in the Catholic, a sacrament. Like, it's a sacred thing, marriage. Even if you're married to an unbeliever. Your faith sanctifies the thing. And it also sanctifies the children that are born. So that they can be dedicated to the Lord. It doesn't make your just because you have children with a bad person doesn't defile the marriage or the children. But if the unbelieving depart, let him depart. A brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God hath called us to peace. So it's saying, if they're not pleased to dwell with you, you're not bound to like, oh, I've got to save my marriage because it's the will of God. Because, it says, let not the husband and the wife get divorced. You cannot expect a non-believer to adhere to your Christian beliefs. You know what I mean? Like, they're just not going to. On many levels, it would be very frustrating to be married to an unbeliever or even a nominal Christian. Sorry. It would be very frustrating indeed in times because it's like they have very different beliefs very often. But if they're pleased to live with you, if your beliefs, if they're pleased, like for a husband, he may be pleased to be married to a Christian woman. He may not believe, but he likes the way she is. She's chaste and moral and a good woman, and she treats him nice, and she follows all the things Paul said. She renders due benevolence. Because like I said, you're not allowed to try to make the divorce happen by making them unhappy. That's not written, but that's implied. Yeah, it's one of those things where people take the letter and think, well, if they want to leave, I can get a divorce. So maybe I could encourage them to leave. That's playing dirty. Not allowed to do that. You're supposed to make the best go of it you can. You don't want to get the divorce. You want them to be pleased to dwell with you. Because, right now, you have a sanctified relationship with them. Even though they're an unbeliever, the relationship is sanctified. If it's going to be defiled, let them defile it of their own accord, through their own, deeds or attitudes or whatever. Let them be unhappy with you as a Christian or something. I'm tired of your moralizing, or whatever. But because God, He's given us this, God has not called us, He's called us to peace. He's not called us to bondage. Marriage isn't meant to be this horrible prison where you're struggling to make it work when the other person is just horrible. It does take two. It doesn't mean, another thing is, it doesn't mean you're supposed to make a good faith effort to make it work. It doesn't mean you have to do everything. You know what I mean? It doesn't mean you don't want to be culpable, but on the other hand, you don't have to go so far beyond. You don't have to go beyond what you would do to be reconciled to your Christian husband if you had one, or a Christian wife. To to whatever degree that is meaningful. We don't have to go so far beyond the call of duty. We should try hard. We should go beyond maybe what we would be willing to, for Christ's sake, to forgive and to reconcile. But if they're unreasonable and unbelieving and they want to divorce you, let them go. You're not bound. Unless you don't want to let them go, you want to keep fighting for it, go ahead. That's all the more, I'm trying to avoid saying all more power to you, because I just feel like it's so meaningless. But, you are all the better for doing so. Verse 16, for what knowest thou, O wife, whether thou shalt save thy husband? Or how knowest thou, O man, whether thou shalt save thy wife? It could be that it takes time after 10 years of watching your chaste conversation, and then something happens. Maybe they lose a family member, who knows, or something, just they have a brush with death, or I don't know. Or maybe they start looking at themselves and saying, like, maybe they just realize how much they love you. And then they start saying, after so many years, because young people often are not very attentive to the things that are important to them. Because they don't know how important they are. It takes years sometimes before you realize how much some things mean to you. Sorry, something hurt. I can't move my head without pain. So, they don't realize how much things mean to them. So after so many years, they might start getting sentimental, and they might also start thinking they would like to be like you, a believer. But sometimes that takes time. Sometimes your um, behavior will testify more than all the preaching in the world, and you don't know what's going to happen down the road. So certainly, if you were going to be the agent of someone else's salvation through Christ, imagine what a wrong you do if you just divorced them early on when they were pleased to dwell with you, but not quite committed to Christ yet. The Lord is very, in this sense, it is, He asks a lot of us, but He is also sort of setting aside His own, like He allows you to be married to someone who's not a believer and allows them to abide in unbelief, perhaps only for a time. If you stay married long enough and you have a good relationship, you're almost certainly going to save them, actually. You know what I mean? I find it hard to see how that love would not move someone after so many years eventually towards faith, especially if they knew that was your earnest desire. But as God hath distributed to every man, as the Lord hath called every one, so let him walk. And so ordain I in all churches. What he's saying is, you don't know whether you might save them or not. And what God has given you, as He has called you, walk that. Is like, especially if you're a Christian now, don't go and marry an atheist. Okay? If you're a serious Christian, don't but I like him. It's like you're being foolish. Because if you're a committed Christian, then Christ is the center of your life. If you don't have someone orbiting around the same thing, you're a fool to marry them. Because there's going to be trouble, and you're in for you're going to sacrifice yourself to try to save them, and there's who knows, you may save them, right? But that's not guaranteed. And not only that, Paul has in mind people who were probably already married to an unbeliever when they became an unbeliever. Maybe you're married for 10, 20 years, 10 years already, and you marry, and you become a Christian, right? And like Paul's saying, don't rush off and get a divorce, please. Don't get a divorce at all. Make it work, especially if they're happy with you. If they become enraged because you're a believer, if you have a spouse who finds out you've become a Christian, and they become enraged and they throw things and they insist you become an unbeliever, and this doesn't let up, maybe that's there's a reason whereby a Christian may, I think you can just say for them, even though they may say, no, I want you to stay, you're just going to stop believing, and they never let up after so long a time. You can get divorced as far as I'm concerned. Like the Christian could initiate in that case, because they're not pleased to dwell with you. They want you to be converted to an unbeliever. Right? So that's also, it's not your fault you're a Christian. That's one thing you make no apologies for. But, you don't become a Christian, and then if they won't become a Christian, you start withholding due benevolence, meaning, the sexual intercourse, or lesser sexual favors, just attention, affection. He says due benevolence because there's a lot of affection it says goodwill literally in the previous passage where it said render due benevolence. It says the Greek says goodwill, and that's a euphemism for sexual contact, which to me, even any way you kiss your spouse that you wouldn't kiss your mother or a child, that's sexual. Any contact you have with another person, whether you're married or not, any contact that is not something you would do with your mother or father, in all righteousness, right? Or your grandmother, any kind of affection shown, that is sex, according to me. that is sex. People think, oh, well, I was just tongue kissing with someone. That's sex. That's sexual in nature. It's not having sex. It's sexual in nature. I mean, come on. Anything that if your spouse was doing it with someone else, you would think was unacceptable is probably because it was sexual. I'm just making that point. As God hath distributed to every man, as the Lord hath called everyone. Well, what he's saying is, it's something he mentions, let every man abide in the calling wherein he was called. If you were married to an unbeliever when you were called, don't rush to get out of that situation. You don't know what's going to come of it. But also, if you're not married to an unbeliever now, don't get married to one. If you want to get married, marry another Christian. Marry another committed Christian if you're a committed Christian. That is important. You can sacrifice a lot of things on the way to that, or you should be willing to sacrifice a lot of things. I remember a friend of mine was told me oh, he wanted to find a woman, but if she wasn't just dynamite, hot, attractive, he wanted his Rachel. And I remember thinking to myself, are you her Jacob? I mean, Jacob was quite a guy. He wrestled with the angel. He made, he turned situations that were against him on their head and used them to his advantage. He usurped his brother's inheritance. He usurped his uncle's flocks and made himself a wealthy man. I mean, he certainly had a lot of skill. It's like, who are you? I mean, what kind of man are you that you deserve such a thing? And, because I was of the opinion, and I understand it's difficult, I was raised in a family where attractiveness was pretty high on the totem pole of important things. It was made obvious to me early on that it's I always felt like I felt like the black sheep of the family in a lot of ways because I felt like I was kind of a goofy looking kid. And certainly arguments can be made that was true. But whatever, it's but what it is that, most kids are cute in actuality, go look at a picture of kindergarten kids, like a class picture, and you look back and are any of these kids ugly? Some kids are ugly, I guess. I don't know. What I'm saying is there's a lot of vain reasons people put on limitations on who they're willing to marry, and it's not easy to overcome necessarily. I mean, you do have to be. Marriage requires some level of attraction, but as you get, a more mature mind understands that that's more negotiable than some other things. How you can be quite attracted to someone who you might not think, given time for love to work. And if I found someone, I mean, I'm not looking anymore for sure, but I told him that if you found someone that was committed to the Lord and absolutely and was zealous, and you would not give them a wide, you wouldn't broaden your, I can understand why someone would maybe marry someone who was maybe a nominal Christian because they were just super attractive. I could understand them justifying it in their minds and thinking well, they're a Christian. And marrying them based on looks is really the number one criteria. But that's foolishness. A person should be a committed Christian. A committed Christian should marry a committed Christian. And that's that. And so, and they are not necessarily easy to find. So when you find one, you got to give them as much consideration as possible as potential, because you will be much happier I can test that, you can be much happier with a committed Christian than with anyone else. Because you can work through so much more. Because you can speak to the same things. Yeah, I mean, you both have the same central beliefs and commitments, and that helps you navigate all the other vicissitudes of life, which means the viscous, let's just say the rough patches, right? All the ups and downs of life. But so, if you're called, I make that clear. If you're called and you're already married to an unbeliever, that's one thing, but don't voluntarily marry one. It's a mistake. It is a mistake. And once you do it, you shouldn't. Now you're stuck, and you shouldn't try to get out of it. Now you're in this, but you stepped in it, but it might work out. I just don't like to encourage it too much. I feel bad for people who did it already. I don't want to, like, they were committed Christians. They married someone who was, maybe not so much. And, I question, honestly, if you marry someone who's not a committed Christian, when you married them, you probably weren't as committed yourself, I'm assuming. I don't understand how you could, like, knowing what you know. When I met my wife, that was her whole deal. She was going to marry, well, she wasn't even thinking, if she would ever get married, she was more mindful to become a nun or something. But if she would get married, it would have to be to a committed Christian. Deeply, someone who was as committed as she was, or more. As any man called being circumcised, let him not become uncircumcised. That's purely rhetorical, because once you're circumcised, it's kind of a... I've heard of men trying to restore their foreskins. And I would just say, I think you're thinking way too much about your genitals. I understand, I don't know, some people got a body thing, it's like, you're not used to it the way it's been. I don't know, like, I wish I had it back. I don't know. I understand. I mean, I'm not, only, like, some of my sons were circumcised, but only because it became a medical necessity, or we were told it was a medical necessity when they were older. So, like, my oldest has something most men don't, which is memories of his circumcision. I remember him describing it, and like after, because you go out, but then you wake up, and he remembers being put to sleep, and then they cut his penis, and then yeah, that's literally what he said. I went to sleep, and then they cut my penis, and then he woke up and he ripped the bandage off, and he was screamed. It was pretty horrific. So most men don't get to remember that, and that's pretty wild. But the other thing, well, the point here is this: any called an uncircumcision, let him not become circumcised. And he's using this as an analogy for what he was talking about before about marriage. If you're called being married to an unbeliever, don't seek to change, to undo that situation through radical means, like cutting off the relationship suddenly. Well, I'm a believer now, and if you won't convert, I'm going to leave. That's not what you do. And that's like a circumcision. Like, well, I'm a believer now, I'm going to get my genitals cut. Or I'm a believer now, I'm going to have my genitals restored. Because, oddly enough, well, like in a sense of like being anxious to run off and find a spouse is also, I think my wife had the right idea. If I were to get married, it would have to be like this. But she wasn't seeking a husband. I was seeking a wife. I was actively seeking a wife. So, but then I did not actually find, like I think I've mentioned this many times, I had a plan for how I was going to sort out the bad candidates from the good. But then the Lord brought Katie into my life so that negated everything. She came along apart from any dating or anything, and so that changed all that. I never had to implement my strategy. Oh man, my eye is just super dry. I'm sorry about the consistent late starts. It's just sometimes I'm not given the luxury of going to sleep at a godly hour. Circumcision is nothing, and uncircumcision is nothing but the keeping the commandments of God. That's kind of a weird thing to say, don't you think? Like, circumcision is nothing except keeping the commandments of God. What? It's nothing. It's just keeping the commandments of God. That's all. Nothing to see here. Move along. You're not doing anything important like keeping the commandments of God. Oh, wait. No, you are. You are keeping the commandments. So I guess that suddenly just struck me as like, see, that's... You sometimes, to truly understand the scripture, you have to give yourself over to hearing it. You know what I mean? Like hearing what he's saying. And I think now, okay, but wait. Okay, why is he speaking so lightly? He's saying it's nothing? It's just keeping the commandments of God? When are we commanded to be uncircumcised? That's another thing. I think he's speaking a figure about marriage, actually. Being married is nothing, and being unmarried is nothing. But being married and staying married is keeping the commandments of God? Well, maybe. There was a question in the early church as to whether the Greeks had to be compelled to be circumcised because to become Christians. Because it was part of what Jews had to do. They had to be circumcised. Paul's position was, no, they do not need to be circumcised. And the council in Jerusalem, in the book of Acts, I forgot the exact chapter, but it's not hard to find if you search. Because I could give you key terms. You'll find the passage. The only thing they required of them was that they avoid things sacrificed to idols and drinking blood and things strangled and fornication. That was one of the fornication was slipped right in there as and you know why? I realize now it's not that there aren't other things you have to do as far as to fulfill righteousness. As far as carnal commandments. Because here's the thing. You say, okay, circumcision isn't important anymore. It was part of, the circumcision, there's a part in the prophets, I believe it's Jeremiah, which says, circumcise the foreskins of your heart. It's a symbolic removing of this flesh, this superfluous bit of flesh on the end of something that, some men complain about it being gone, whatever. And I don't know. I don't know if it's better to have it or not as far as for the thing. They're worried about their sensitivity and their pleasure and all that stuff. And it's like, dude, there's enough pleasure in the world without having to have the last drop of pleasure. You know what I mean? It's like, it's just a certain level of like, I must have the utmost experience or I'm just unsatisfied, unhappy as a human being if I can't have that ultimate sensitivity. In a world where some men suffer from premature ejaculation, other ones got to take pills to make themselves get an erection. I don't know, worrying about the sensitivity of your whatever. I don't know. I think it's just ridiculous. I guess because there are people who seek to be uncircumcised. It exists. I can tell you the weird things they do. How do I even know this? I think I heard it on a radio program. Yeah, because people complain about being mutilated as children. And, I get the point. I'm a Gentile. I don't think I need to be circumcised. They said they do it for medical reasons. It wasn't a religious thing. And some people say it's not medically necessary. Sometimes it becomes medically necessary. Like I said, the two of my kids, they had it done later because it became medically necessary, I guess. So that's that. You know what I mean? It's like, I'm not a doctor, and I know there was problems, and so I did what they suggested. Maybe I was wrong. But it seemed like the right thing to do at the time, and I was much younger, so, I didn't think of, I don't know. But the point is, for them, it had to do with their identity. A circumcised man was a Jew. That's what made him a Jew. It's part of what made him distinct as a Jew from the Gentiles. And a Gentile having a foreskin, it made him distinct from Jews being circumcised. This is probably pretty boring for women, this conversation about men, but there's a general principle to be learned. And like I said with marriage, to abide in the calling where which you are called. It doesn't mean there's no changes in your life. But some things don't need to change. Like, you don't have to marry someone new to become a Christian. You don't have to cut yourself to become a Christian. You know what I mean? And if you're cut, you don't have to, because now you're saying, oh, I don't have to be cut, so should I reverse it? Should I undo the carnal? And the thing is, he doesn't cover it here. And a lot of Christians don't understand this aspect. And I did a study on it on oraclesofgod.org. On my doctrine page or my studies page, one or the other, you can find a study that I did. It's controversial to some people, but it's very solid. How Christ abolished the commandments. Because in Christ, the commandments of God have been abolished. The Old Testament commandments are abolished. That's why we don't have to be circumcised. Because that was a perpetual commandment for the Jews, that they should be circumcised. And in becoming Christians, it is an extension of Judaism from the Old Testament. And that's why it was a controversial conversation of, do the Gentiles have to be circumcised? Some said yes. Of course they do. Otherwise they can't be special like us, the Jews. And they saw it as the Gentiles would become like Jews. I mean, it was actually if you think about it, those who were the Judaizers were not all intending bad. They were thinking, we're bringing the Gentiles into our Jewish family. They're becoming part of the family of God. And we're going to accept them. But we think they need to be circumcised, and they have to adhere to the restrictions of the diet and all the laws that we follow. All right? But prior to that, the Gentiles were unclean dogs. So you got to understand that these people have expanded their minds. They have opened themselves to the idea that Gentiles could be part of their family. They could be they could be one together with the Gentiles through faith in Christ. But they also wanted them to do these other things and obey the carnal commandments. Restrictions of diet, outward appearance, a lot of that stuff. And Paul objected, and the council agreed that they didn't have to be circumcised, that they would be saved through faith. That was what the gospel was, that through belief in Christ, through faith in his resurrection, you could be saved. And not through doing things like getting circumcised or even doing things like good works or anything like that. That works cannot save you. Faith saves you. And faith does works in you, but not the carnal commandments of the law. Well, in 2 Corinthians, which we will cover after 1 Corinthians, chapter 3, Paul talks about how, he very explicitly talks about how the commandments have been done away. That they are done away, they are passing away, they've gone away because Christ fulfilled all. And people always say, well, Jesus said, whoever shall, that these commandments are not going to pass away till all be fulfilled. And Christ fulfilled them. And it's how I know that? Because we're not required to be circumcised. If Christ hadn't fulfilled all the commandments, then all the commandments would still be in place. And we would have to be circumcised. We'd have to wear tassels on our garments. We couldn't be clean shaven like I am. We would have to never round the corners of our beards. I mean, some Jews don't follow that orthodox teaching of like never round the corners of your beards. I know plenty of clean shaven Jews. And that may be so, but it'd be a discussion we'd have to have. There are ultra Orthodox Jews who always have beards and side locks, and they wear phylacteries, and they do everything. They try to do everything. So, it's an open question within some Jews justified shaving and all kinds of things and dressing like Westerners. But that's not like an uncontested truth among them. Some don't think so. Even among Christians, we still have Judaizers who still think you ought to keep all the carnal commandments. I've had run-ins with those people. They believe you should wear tassels on your garments. You should never eat pork or any of the other forbidden meats. You ought to be circumcised, and they go that far. You have to keep the Sabbath, and the way you keep the Sabbath is never quite delineated. They're more concerned that you acknowledge that you must keep the Sabbath. I think they're not so upset. And I understand, it's one thing to break a commandment that you acknowledge is a good commandment. And it's another thing to deny you even have to keep it. That, if I say, I can do this is righteous. That can be deadly. And so it can be a fearful thing to step out and say, hey, I don't need to obey the commandment of God of circumcision. I can just be uncircumcised. There's a boldness there. There's, whoa, wait a second. The scriptures say this is a perpetual commandment among all your generations for all times. How can you say this is now passed away? And it's because of Christ. So, when he says this is nothing but the keeping the commandments of God, he may be referring specifically to in terms of these are the Old Testament commandments of God, contextually. Old Testament commandments of God, carnal commandments of God, which are in and of themselves nothing. Like whether I'm circumcised or not, one, you can't even see it. Two, it doesn't affect any of my behaviors. You know what I mean? Like the carnal commandments are all in themselves behaviors. Like cutting my penis is a behavior. Like I had my thing, something physical happened to me. But there's no actual righteousness that I do with that. Like it doesn't prevent adultery or fornication or masturbation or anything. You know what I mean? Being circumcised is literally nothing. Like it's just a symbolic commandment which the Jews obeyed as part of their covenant with God. It's a symbolic removing of excess flesh, and taking away part, not to be different, but also to dedicate ourselves to the Lord, right? In the Old Testament, and so, but it is literally nothing. Being uncircumcised is literally nothing. The only thing it is keeping the commandments of God. Like whereas thou shalt not steal. Not stealing is more than just keeping the commandments of God. It's actually a thing. Like if we steal, it's a lot different than not stealing. You know what I'm saying? There's a huge difference between stealing and not stealing. Being circumcised and uncircumcised, on the face of it there's a difference, but on the moral level, whether you happen to be circumcised or not, there is a zero there. Nothing. It is only a commandment and nothing else. There's no righteousness in it without the commandment. Like, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not commit adultery. Even the Gentiles have prohibitions on these things. You know what I mean? Like, adultery is frowned on in all kinds of non-Christian societies. Once you make a marriage compact, contract, vows, whatever, it is considered pretty universally low and underhanded and wicked to cheat. And so, um, that's that. Sorry, I got distracted with somebody's watch is beeping, or it was. But as God hath distributed every man, as the Lord hath called every one, so let him walk. Oh wait, I already read that one. Circumcision. Let every man abide in the calling wherewith he was called. Because it's nothing. Being circumcised doesn't make you more righteous. Being uncircumcised doesn't make you more righteous. Whereas stealing or not stealing is a major difference in righteousness. Not stealing is a lot more righteous than stealing. Stealing is unrighteous. So there's something more there than just a commandment, than just an injunction, do this to be different. Do this to be different is not it's totally arbitrary. Art thou called being a servant? Care not for it. I mean, don't worry about it. But if thou mayest be made free, use it rather. I mean, hey, if you're called being a servant or a slave, don't let that be like, I'm a slave. Oh no. Because whether you're a slave or a free man, morally, there's nothing against you in being a slave or being free. You know what I mean? A man can be a slave, like he says, I don't remember if this place is where it says, but a man that's a slave is the Lord's freeman. And a man that is free is the Lord's slave. That in different callings, because in a sense, by being a slave, you're relieved of so many responsibilities that you have, in some special way, you have a greater freedom in Christ, spiritually. Whereas a man, like I have a family, I've got many responsibilities. I was having such trouble doing my Bible studies weekly that I was like, maybe I should just get up early every day before anything happens and do a Bible study. And I said sometimes I've been late a lot lately is direct relation to having to settle on lesser amounts of sleep. Sometimes things won't let me go. It's always things like work or outside the house, but these are obligations and things that I have to see to, and so it's just like I've said. I don't remember if I said in this study, but the king is the servant of all the people. He has all this power, but he also has all this responsibility. He's responsible if something goes wrong. If the kingdom falls, the number one target for beheading is going to be him. And people suffer, but you're not as like target number one. I mean, I'm not saying it's good to be a slave. He says if you can be free and use that. It would be better to use freedom. Freedom is better because you can take on more responsibility, and it's good to take on responsibility. You should take on as much responsibility as you can bear. You know what I mean? If you're called being a servant, don't worry about it. Don't feel like you've got to fix the situation, especially if you're content there. Because some people were content in their servitude, especially you talk about New Testament times. Not the South of America and of the American antediluvian period. I don't know why it's called antediluvian. Before the flood. That's anti-deluge. I don't know. I don't know why they call it that. Or antebellum is what they call it. I don't even know what that means. In the Old South, that's not the same. In the Romans' time, slavery was not usually okay, all the blacks are slaves. It wasn't like that. Because even in some states, if a free black was found wandering around, he could be compelled into slavery. That's ridiculous. In the Roman times, they would have thought that was ridiculous because a man was free not based on his race, but based on whether or not he was free. Oftentimes people became indentured bondmen because of debts or because of other things. In fact, in the early American times, there were whites who came over as indentured servants, which is essentially slavery. But it was not the form of slavery which took shape later, which was among the most wicked forms of slavery the world has ever seen. Like I said, because in the Bible, the fugitive slave law was, if a slave runs away, you can't return him to his master. You shall not return him to his master. I'm going to cover that sometime. I want to do a little because people always rip on the Bible because it acknowledges slavery and it also permits it. But it's like, and they'll say how like the Southerners use the Bible to, you can use the Bible to like, to support a lot of kooky things. And so just because they use the Bible to support their theories, the Bible is used all the time to support plenty of things that aren't true. But I wanted to do a little bit of an apologetic with what does the Bible really say about slavery? And for a lot of people it would be shocking, I think, because they have no idea what it teaches about slavery. And how really different it is from any conception we had of that in the Old South. So if you can be freed, by all means be free and use that. Take responsibility for your life. Stop being a servant, But if you are, you don't have to worry I'm a servant. I can't do everything I want. Don't fret. Just serve Christ in the calling in which you are called. It's not like being a Christian now means you got to run away. Don't get yourself in trouble. Freedom might be around the corner. You don't know what the Lord has in store for you. You're called being a slave. You don't know that 2-3 years from now, you might be set free with the master's blessing and he's heaping gifts on you. Who knows? So, we got to remember that all things work together for our good, no matter what situation we happen to be in. It is for our ultimate good. It's not an immediate good necessarily, or the good we want necessarily immediately, but ultimate good, yes. That's what everything is working towards in Christ for those who are called. For he that is called in the Lord, being a servant, is the Lord's freeman. Likewise also he that is called being free is Christ's servant. Because your freedom means, okay, now God can ask so much more of you. A bondman is sort of free in that he has to obey. He already has an earthly master he has to obey. So his Christianity occurs entirely within that context. So he's the Lord, in the Lord's sake, he's sort of free in a certain way, meaning you're free of responsibilities. You have work you have to do, right? But you don't have to take thought for all these things. You just have to do what you're told. But someone who's free has to take thought. They have to take responsibility. And that is better. And Paul acknowledges that. Use that rather. If you can be made free, take it. Don't cling to your chains. The slave clings to his chains, he must have them struck from him. Because once you become accustomed to servitude, it's hard to it's like actually prison. Guys who become institutionalized, they come out into society, they don't know how to order their lives. Because they've been so institutionalized, used to being told when they can drop their pants to use the toilet, right? It's from then to when they get to bathe, when they work, when everything is ordered, they're told everything to do. And they come out in society and all of a sudden they're just free. And they haven't maybe been behind bars for 10, 20 years or more. So they have no idea what they're doing. You're bought with a price, be not servants of men. Meaning that even if you are the servant of men, you serve Christ first. Meaning, you may be a slave, but know this, that in God's eyes, you are free. You know what I mean? You're not serving, you can be a man's servant in the flesh, but still be God's servant. But also, if you can be made free, be made free. Don't be someone's servant. Serve Christ. There's a sense in which you can still do it. You don't have to immediately run away from servitude. Don't worry about it. You are bought, but Christ has purchased you with his blood, as we talked about. And so therefore, he is your owner. I've gone over. Okay. So we go to another subject in verse 25. And then he repeats in 24. Let every man abide wherein he is called there and abide with God. Okay, thanks for joining me today. Look forward to studying with you again tomorrow. Oh, I closed my thing. Okay, there we go.
Prepare war, wake up the mighty men, let all the men of war draw near, let them come up, beat your plowshares and the swords, and your pringlets and the spears, let the weak say I am strong, assemble yourselves and come, all ye heathen, and gather yourselves together round about